Hello, today we'll be talking about the ecology of marine fish communities. We've already talked a bit about the factors that influence, potentially affect the makeup of the fish you see within a marine community. We've talked about those abiotic and biotic factors. And we're going to look at this specifically in marine environments. We've talked about freshwater, but the marine system makes up more of the potential habitat for the fishes, and we see a lot of diversity of the habitat types within the marine realm. So we'll start by breaking the potential marine communities into two major groups. We have those near shore or coastal systems. These are noretic choices, and we can break this into two groups. We have our intertidal and our subtidal. So the intertidal, they have an area that's exposed during that tidal cycle. So sometime during the waxing and waning of the tide, this area is going to be exposed. The subtidal, that's never exposed even during the lowest of the low tides. So we'll look at the variety of habitat types we have within these and see how that influences the marine community. The other potential options we have for marine communities are out in the oceanic system. And here we have the pelagic. This is our open ocean system, not near the bottom, and our demersal fishes, and these are the ones that are going to be found closer to the bottom. So for today, we're just going to focus on the near shore coastal systems and look at some of these noretic communities. When we look at marine communities, we have a lot of different fishes out there. So this is our potential for those biotic interactions. We have our residents and we have our visitors. Our resident fishes, we can break into two groups. We have our true residents and our partial residents. True residents, those are the fish that are going to spend their entire life cycle within that habitat type. We call those true residents. That's where they're always found. Our partial residents, well, they're residents, but only for part of their life cycle. So it's an obligate part. They have to spend part of it there. It could be the juvenile stage while they're eating and developing into adults. It could be the adult stage, and that this is where the adults come to feed. Our visitors, on the other hand, these are going to be making short-term visits to the area. We can have regular visitors, which are going to show up on a regular, like a seasonal cycle. Think of our spawning aggregations that will return to the same spawning ground regularly. They're only going to visit, though. They're not going to be there for any length of time, a few days, maybe a few weeks, and then they'll move off again. And then we have irregular visitors, and these don't come with any sort of seasonal pattern at all. They just maybe show up and then they leave. This could be like a tuna randomly visiting a reef, hang around for a few days and then pass on. It's not going to come back every fall for that visit, but you may see it again and you may not. When we look at these noretic habitats, we see a lot of abiotic factors that influence our species makeup, the other fish we see in that community assemblage. And there's three major abiotic factors that have a strong influence on our potential for fishes. This is going to be our energy, our complexity, and our productivity. So by energy, we're talking about the wave action we have here. Is it high energy? Are there lots of waves moving? Or is it fairly low energy with kind of a slow, gradual tidal change? How complex is the habitat? Are we just a bare, open, sandy bottom? Do we have lots of rocks to hide in? Is there vegetation? Hiding places for potential prey, anything from invertebrates to smaller fishes, as well as for predators to hide out and be able to ambush their prey. And the other big factor is productivity. How much nutrients are actually available to start the bottom of the food chain? Is there a lot of nutrients available to be able to have that diversity, or is it a low level that kind of restricts the amount of growth you can have? And we see this really interesting relationship. If you have an area with low energy, high productivity, and high complexity, okay, so this is low energy, not a lot of dramatic wave action, high productivity, so you've got lots of nutrients available to start that food chain, and high complexity, so you have a habitat that has lots of those little hiding places, again, for either for food or for a refuge. If you have these three conditions, then you're going to see high diversity, lots of different types of fishes, and high biomass, lots of numbers of those types of fishes. All right, so you see the difference between diversity and biomass. Diversity is the number of types of fish you have, your number of species, versus your biomass, which is your number of fishes. All right, so if we've got low energy, high productivity, high complexity, then we should see high diversity and high biomass. Now we're going to work our way through some of the major types of these coastal habitats and look at the relationship between the energy, productivity, and complexity with the diversity and biomass we see in those habitats. We'll start with the rocky intertidal habitat. So this is pretty much what it looks like, right? We've got rocks, We're intertidal, we get the waves coming in and coming out. But because of where we sit for the tide, there will be periods of time where we're kind of, the tide's going to go out and we're going to be pretty quiet. We're going to have pools of water, and other times where that tide comes in and we're covered in water. So we have high energy with those waves, lots of wave action happening here. High complexity, lots of structure, lots of rocky refuges. But we also have extreme temperature and salinity fluctuations. So you can't really see high diversity and high biomass here. This area is going to be dominated by species that are highly specialized to handle these changing conditions. That high energy makes it difficult, makes it a very harsh environment, along with the changing environmental conditions. So you don't see a huge diversity of fishes. The ones we do see have those adaptations. These are going to be things like our clingfishes, our gobies that have those specialized pectoral fins into that disc that allow them to adhere to rocks. It could be other ones here, like our prickleback with that nice elongate body form, allows it to get into those crevices during the high tide and those tidal changes. So that's what we tend to see in this habitat, is not a huge diversity and not a huge biomass, but we see these fishes that are specialized for this environment. Our next environment are going to be the exposed beaches. So now we've got high energy, right? We've got those wave action coming in. Low complexity, think of the beach that we go to, like where you would be surfing, right? It's going to be sandy bottom. There's not going to be lots of rocks or boulders or grasses in there. But again, we're still seeing that extreme temperature and salinity fluctuation because we get that changing tide with all the wave action we see there. So this area is very unstable with all those waves. So species have to be able to navigate those difficult physical conditions. And because of the wave action, it makes it easy to become disoriented, makes it very difficult to swim. But that also means that your potential prey is also disoriented. So if you're able to handle the changing conditions, which you will have the temperature and salinity to deal with, you potentially have this option to be able to ambush this disoriented prey. Moving on to the mudflats. So the mudflats are a lot like those beaches we just looked at in the previous slide, but they don't have the energy, right? They don't have the wave flow. So it's low energy, but it's low complexity. We don't have a lot of anything here, right? It's mud. That's pretty much it. Not a lot of structure for the fishes to hide in or potential prey to hide in. And we still have those extreme temperature and salinity fluctuations because we're a tidal flat, right? We're inundated daily with tides, so we'll be covered in the high tide. And when that low tide goes out, now we're going to be exposed. So fish in these conditions have to be able to handle, again, those changing conditions. Remember the mud skippers we looked at earlier in the semester? So those are ones that can live in this habitat. Low complexity, so that means we have low diversity, low potential biomass, but we're not very stable in terms of the chemical makeup, and that makes it difficult to have a big diversity of species here. Now we're getting a little bit more diverse into our salt marshes, our mangrove swamps. Low energy, high complexity. So now we've got the hiding places, but we still have those tidal variations, those extreme temperature and salinity fluctuations that are present. These habitats have a tendency to accumulate the nutrients in the very shallow waters that they have, which make them highly productive. So they actually will have a high biomass, but they'll have a low diversity. They'll be dominated by a few salt-tolerant species that can feed on a wide variety of food items. They can handle the changing conditions, but we don't see a huge number of species, though we do see a fairly high biomass, right? See the difference between those two, right? Large biomass, but low diversity. And they're a very important habitat for lots of our juvenile fishes. They rely on that high productivity to kind of give them a lot of food. They rely on the high complexity of the habitat to give them shelter from predators. But also we're fairly shallow water, and that's going to limit a lot of the large predators, making this a really good place to be if you're a little fish. Our seagrass flats are very similar to the salt marshes and mangrove swamps we just looked at. It's pretty much the same habitat. We've got lots of productivity here, shallow waters, and it's a nursery ground. Here, our main plant that's going to be growing is that seagrass, and that's a very important primary producer for this habitat type. We're low energy, so the tidal change is not a dramatic waves, but we still see that changing where the water becomes deep and becomes shallow, High complexity, lots of potential hiding places, but we're still getting that extreme daily fluctuations with the tidal flow. Seagrass, as I said, is very important. It's our big primary producer in this habitat type, but we don't really see the fishes eating the grass itself. There's some that do, but most of them don't. Most are eating things that grow on the seagrass or are hiding in it. So they may be picking off various epiphytes. They may be removing invertebrates that are hiding in there. And again, with all of this productivity, all of this available nutrients, we do see a lot of our juvenile fishes in here. We've got hiding places and food. It's a great place to be if you're a little fish. There are other fish that are specialized. This is where we'll find our seahorses. They can use their tail to wrap around that seagrass. That allows them to stay in place as we get the tidal change in and out. And they'll use the suction feeding they have to pick off those little tiny invertebrates, the little isopods and amphipods that are found on the grasses. Now we're going to move into water that's a little bit deeper. These are our kelp beds or our kelp forests. Now we have low energy. There's not a huge dramatic tidal change here, not a lot of wave action. High complexity, lots. I mean, look at these brown algae here that grow up to make the kelp beds. It's amazing. And they're typically subtidal, so they're generally going to be underwater all of the time. And they support this very distinctive fish community. We see these off the west coast of lots of continents, including North America, and they are usually referred to as a kelp forest because that's kind of what they are. And the kelp bed is structured by depth, similar to what we would see in a rainforest. These kelp plants can grow 30 meters tall and form really dense stands. And we see like this, we have our kind of, if this was a rainforest, right, you would call these your canopy species, those that are found near the top of the vegetation. They would kind of have our mid-forest species found in the middle, as well as our forest floor species found at the bottom. And you can see already this huge diversity of different fish we have here. This community has all of the factors that we talked about, right? Low energy, because the wave action isn't very high. High complexity with all of the plants there, as well as that high productivity. And again, they're not so much eating the plants as they're eating the things that grow on the plants or that hide in the plants. And with those three factors, we see that high diversity and high biomass found in these kelp forests. Near shore rocky bottoms. Now we have low energy and high complexity. And usually we have a fairly high productivity in these areas as well. We've got lots of hiding places for those fishes to go. We've got that low energy. We don't have that tidal changing with the major temperature, salinity changes that we see. And we see that we get a pretty diverse fish assemblage here. We've got the rocks, which allow for potential food items to attach and to hide. So it might be plants growing, different algae. It might be invertebrates having their little crevices. And then you've got fish, smaller fish that can hide, and that's going to pull in all sorts of those residents and partial residents and visitor species that are going to be eating those invertebrates or eating the fish that are eating those invertebrates. So we see a large diversity in that near shore rocky bottom. And now we have to look at the near shore soft bottom. So the habitats that we've talked up to this point are very specific habitats, and they actually only cover a very small proportion of this neretic available habitats, these continental shelf habitats. The majority of habitats that we see in this neretic nearshore coastal type areas is the soft bottom habitat, relatively low relief, sand and mud habitat. Low energy, but low complexity as well, and that will limit our potential for diversity. Structured primarily by depth and bottom type, so you're going to find certain species associated with that specific nearshore soft bottom, depending on where it is in terms of its depth and exactly what the bottom is made up of. What we see is this interesting influence of diversity with the bottom type. So species aren't that diverse, but if you remove one species, one of those other species will take over and become abundant, keeping the biomass levels fairly high. And when we look at the fisheries here of the Georges Bank, so this is the fishing area here, kind of in the northwest part of the Atlantic, so off the northeastern seaboard in the United States. And what they saw there was that they would fish, and once they kind of used up a fishery, another fish would replace it. So all of these fish coexisted, but the most dominant was the haddock. The cod was kind of always there until it wasn't. But in terms of the ground fish that they were looking for, they were getting the haddock. And then once the haddock started to decrease because they had fished those, then the yellowtail kind of started to take over. And you don't see it on this graph, but then after the yellowtail kind of tanked, then the red hake took over. And then after the red hake tanked, now we're left with just what's left, which is our spiny dogfish and our rays. And those aren't really being fished quite as much, but those are now the dominant one. They've kind of moved in to take over this area. Low diversity of species, high-ish biomass, but it doesn't have a lot of diversity there. So right now it's being used mainly by those cartilaginous fishes, and we'll have to see if it recovers and we get more of the other fishes moving back in. The last type of nearshore neuretic coastal marine habitat we want to talk about are the coral reefs. Coral reefs are just amazing. They have this low energy, they have this high complexity. They actually have really high productivity too. They're really good at cycling the nutrients around, so moving them up the food chain, but then back down to start at the beginning as well. And you get this concentration of the biomass and the nutrients in this one area, and you just see this huge diversity of fishes. High biomass, high diversity. The corals themselves add to this because they have just this complex matrix, and that adds that complexity that we need, those refuges, the structure, the hiding places for the fishes. And the last thing we'll talk about is these coral reefs in just a little bit more detail. Coral reefs are tremendously diverse, but why and how? What makes them so different from the other habitats we've looked at? Why did they have so many more different fishes? Well, there's three hypotheses that have been put forward to kind of describe or explain away this diversity. The first is the competition hypothesis. So this goes back to what we talked about when we talked about competition and this idea of resource partitioning. So the thought is that so many fish can coexist together because it's highly structured, finely partitioned. You can eat this specific thing, and I can eat this specific thing, that other fish can eat only this one. And by cutting up the resources into these really minute areas, these very fine detailed partitions, highly structured, then we can all coexist together. That's a really hard one to test to figure out if that really is what's limiting the diversity or influencing the diversity. A different hypothesis says is the recruitment limitation hypothesis. And this is, there's no structure, it's all chaos. It doesn't really matter what you eat or what kind of fish you are, it's just a lottery. And this goes back to that idea of the fish's life cycle, right? Most of these reef fishes are going to spawn, and the larvae are going to, the eggs are going to float out to sea, and they'll hatch, and the larvae will develop. And they'll float around at mercy of the currents, right? They're not really able to figure out where they want to go. And they might be out there for a week or two, or maybe even a month. And then eventually they'll change, and now they're recruited, and it's time to settle as a juvenile, and they'll come back to the reef. But if you're not near the reef to come back, then you die. There's no place to go. So it's pure lottery. It's luck of the draw. If you happen to be in the right place, you'll come back and settle on the reef, and then you'll grow up, and then you'll be there to eat the food. If not, well, then too bad. You'll hopefully land at some other reef somewhere else. So instead of being highly structured and finely partitioned, it's totally to chance. And there's some evidence to suggest that this might actually be true. The third potential hypothesis is the predation hypothesis. So again, this is unstructured, but now instead of it being kind of luck of the draw of who gets back, now it's luck of survival. So this is saying it's not the larval stage that's the issue, it's the juvenile stage. The larvae transform, the juveniles come back to the reef, but there's predators waiting there, and they're going to eat all of the juveniles they possibly can. The lucky few that survive this, these are the adults that are able to then live on the reef and be there and be present, be part of that community. So you've got some here that say it's just pure luck, and you've got one here that says, oh no, it's all fine, we've got our little rules, everyone follows the rules, and we're all good. It's most likely some combination of these three. For this second one here, they've done some experiments where they'll take, like, near where there's a real reef, they'll make an artificial reef, and they'll watch it to see what fish settle there. And so they look at the juveniles and the spawning, and they wait to see who comes, and it really seems to be pure chaos, and it's just whoever happens to land at that reef, they become the adults that live on the reef. but it's probably some influence among those three different things, or even something totally different. We've talked a lot about all of the factors that go into fish communities and how different things influence it. And we could see how just having a bad year for a storm when a certain species spawns could limit their ability to recruit to a particular reef. We've talked about competition and how we can partition those resources and coexist. So it's most likely some combination of these three or some interplay between them. So this was our overview of the ecology of marine communities, looking at those noretic or coastal, those close to shore marine communities. We looked at the intertidal groups as well as the subtidal. We're looking at the factors that affect the diversity of the community, looking at how productivity levels, energy levels, and complexity levels, how that affects the potential of biomass and diversity that we find within these community types. As always, if you have any questions on today's material, please let me know. Thank you.